One comment from Jonathan Heawood, who's the chief executive, I think that's right, of PAN.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you all. And I think it's great that the panel all brought in aspects of culture in their opening presentations. I'm very conscious of time. Anthony's making chopping motions, but I did want to ask everyone very briefly. You've all spoken about the role of artists, musicians, writers in advancing and developing our understanding of rights, and in some cases actually advancing those rights themselves. I wanted to, in order to give a bit of a steer to our artists and our writers and our musicians, could you just very quickly perhaps come up with one example each of something which has really moved your understanding, or which you think historically has actually pushed our rights and liberties forward?
You want to go ahead, Billy?
I would say, for me, the work of George Orwell, the writing of George Orwell, has been a huge inspiration. His perspective as both an internationalist and a patriot, someone who had to, having fought in the Spanish Civil War and being very, very anti-Tory, couldn't stand Churchill, had to struggle with the idea of coming round to defending the country during the war, and his input generally is he's probably the writer that's most influenced me as a songwriter.
Cory, go. I'm now holding two mics. I'm in stereo. So it's a tough question. So here's what's really inspired me about our capacity to, as a society, enforce, or rather claim the rights that are our due, not that the state gives us, but that belong to us from the beginning. And it's the rise of internet culture and the rise of, for all the bad and all the good, it's the rise of a system in which we are all part of a single dialogue, in which we can make any kind of art, in which any person can communicate with any other person without any third party intervening, has given rise to a global dialogue that I think beggars the imagination of even the most optimistic philosophers of a generation ago. And I mean that literally. You read the science fiction of the 1960s, and the closest they come is that they think maybe we would have a really good video-on-demand service with some video phone on the side. No one predicted just the fantastic Cambrian explosion of genres, of forms, of ideas, and of participation from every corner of the globe that the Internet's enabled. And that's, for me, why keeping the network free is the first step to keeping us all free.
I'd say here to that. Gosh, this is so difficult because hundreds one could name. I Proust for the very complexity of the human being that is set out, which is so antithetical to any kind of management by states. But really, Virginia Woolf, because of women and the room of her own. And finally, I think I have to say, because it's 20 years since the fatwa, Salman Rushdie, but not only because of the great imaginative work, but because of the global response to a fiction which was not particularly read at the time, but which somehow created a stir, and the political lessons that have come out of that, and the way it has, in fact, in this country, given people who then came to call themselves Muslims, although there are many, many different kinds of Muslims, and they came from many different parts of the world, a voice which they didn't really have before that series of protests, although it was a very negative protest to begin with.
I actually think it's a fairly relatively straightforward question to ask, or to answer. Culture has always defined the period we live in. It has always driven us forward. It's what separates us in many ways from everything else on this planet. You can go back 400 years and start with William Shakespeare in St. Crispin Day's speech, Henry V, drive all the way through Sean O'Casey, Juno and the Paycock, Brendan Behan, and any amount of other stuff. For me, there's an underlying remarkable thing about culture that overrides an awful lot of everything else, and ultimately culture makes the world within which we live our lives much more insightful, much brighter, much better, much more intelligent places within which to live our lives, and no amount of data collection will ever achieve that.
Paul?
Two things immediately spring to mind. One is listening to Bob Marley in the Greyhound pub down the Fulham Road in May of 1973, singing "Get Up, Stand Up for Your Rights," and thinking about what that meant in misappropriating or borrowing the language of the UN Declaration and putting it into the lives of ordinary people. And the second thing is, is really the poetry of Shelley from 1819, that moment in the history of this country. Men of England, wherefore plough for the lords who lay ye low. I met murder on his way, had a face like Castlereagh. Well, I don't know which of our recent custodians of our liberty might be likened to that, but there's something about the example of Shelley in speaking at that moment in English history that I think we need to kind of recover and remember. I don't know if that's on the GCSE syllabus, but I rather doubt that it is.
Well, I... to our children.
I think we have to wind up there. I'm getting slashing mark from my co-director.
What about Henry Cooper?
What about Henry Cooper?
Henry Porter. What's your
Henry Cooper. He was.
What's your idea? Come on.
Well, I'll tell you. I'll be honest. I was hoping I wouldn't have to answer it, but recently I read a biography of Voltaire and his human rights actor. He really invented human rights campaigning. And I was most moved by that. So that's the most recent thing. But Orwell is in my mind the whole time. And if you notice how much, I can't think of another writer now whose name appears more in print. Who's it? Shakespeare, but but Orwell is so relevant to our lives now.
Probably a barometer for the quality of a society, how often you need to make recourse to Orwell to understand what's happening. 1984 not being a manual for statecraft and all.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the end of this session, and it's the end of the Convention on Modern Liberty. I thank you for all staying. And we hope to see you again.